The explosion didn't just break the silence, it tore the fabric of the night into jagged, burning ribbons. From my perch on the jagged lip of the obsidian ridge, the crystalline spire looked like a broken tooth leaking neon blue marrow. That blue wasn't fire, at least not any fire Earth had ever known before the Aethel arrived. It was ionized plasma, the byproduct of an Aethel energy core going critical. I was on my feet before my brain had fully processed the shockwave. The air tasted like ozone and burnt hair. My cabin, a reinforced shack tucked away in the shadows of the Ironroot Mountains, groaned as the secondary blast rattled its foundations. Most people in the valleys below wouldn't even have woken up. Their neural weaves would have filtered out the noise as sub-threshold environmental stimulus, keeping them in a blissful, drug-induced slumber. But I wasn't most people. I was a ghost, offline, unlinked, and currently the only person within 5 kilometers who knew how to handle a structural collapse without waiting for an Aethel algorithm to give the green light. I grabbed my kit, a battered rucksack filled with pre-contact climbing gear and a stolen phase shifter. My hands moved with a muscle memory that ignored the trembling of the earth. I'd been a search and rescue specialist back when the world was still called Earth, before the benevolent overseers decided we needed their brand of peace. "Voss, you're a damn fool," I muttered to myself, kicking the door open. The descent toward the spire usually took 2 hours. I did it in 40 minutes, sliding down shale slopes and free climbing down 10-meter drops that would have snapped the ankles of any optimized human. The spire loomed ahead, a 300-meter needle of shimmering white alloy now scarred by black carbon and weeping blue fire. 2 Aethel peacekeepers were already at the perimeter. They stood perfectly still, their crystalline skin reflecting the chaos with a terrifying lack of emotion. Their long, multi-jointed fingers rested on the hilts of their Echo Pulse rifles. "Citizen, halt!" the taller one said. Its voice wasn't a sound so much as a vibration in my teeth, a synthesized harmonic designed to induce calm. "This sector is under total quarantine. Return to your designated dwelling for metabolic rest." "I'm a rescue specialist," I snapped, flashing my old badge, a piece of plastic and metal that meant nothing to them. "You've got a level 5 containment breach and structural failure. Your drones are useless in that plasma field. I'm going in." "Your assistance is illogical," the second peacekeeper chimed in, stepping into my path. Its eyes, glowing like soft amethysts, scanned my biometrics. "You are an unlinked, high risk of physiological trauma. We have the situation under optimal control." "Optimal control?" I pointed at a section of the spire as it detached and fell, crushing a row of automated transport pods. "In my world, that's called a clusterfuck." Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the fire. It wasn't a vibration or a harmonic. It was a scream. Raw, high-pitched, and undeniably desperate. It was the kind of sound the Aethel weren't supposed to be able to make. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't even think. I slammed the thumb stud on my phase shifter. The world blurred into a monochromatic smear as the device temporarily desynchronized my atoms from the local space-time. I charged straight through the peacekeeper's chest, a sensation like walking through cold, wet silk, and sprinted past the perimeter fence. "Unauthorized entry! Target marked for non-lethal suppression!" The guards hissed behind me, but they couldn't follow. Their heavy armor and link systems wouldn't let them enter a fluctuating plasma field without a direct override from the central mind. Inside the spire, the air was a soup of toxins. My lungs burned with every breath. I pulled a filter mask over my face, the rubber smelling of stale sweat and old victories. The interior was a labyrinth of twisted white metal and shattered glass that hummed with a dying frequency. "Is anyone here?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the hiss of leaking gases. Another cry, closer this time. I rounded a corner and stopped. A woman was pinned beneath a fallen structural rib, a massive beam of semi-translucent material that weighed at least 500 kilograms. She wasn't human. Her skin was the pale, iridescent green of a shallow sea, and her hair flowed like liquid mercury against the floor. But it was her eyes that caught me, golden, wide with terror, and weeping silver fluid. "Stay still," I said, dropping my kit. "I'm going to get you out." She looked at me, and for a second, the gold in her eyes flickered. "Human, you are the one from the ridge." The ghost. Save the biography for later, lady, I grunted, wedging a hydraulic jack beneath the beam. You're bleeding silver all over my boots. You must leave, she wheezed, her chest heaving. They are not coming to save me. They are coming to erase the data. If they find you here— I've been on their to-do list for 10 years, I muttered, pumping the handle of the jack. The beam groaned. One more entry won't kill me. With a final, bone-wrenching heave, the beam lifted just enough. I grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled. She was surprisingly light, her bones likely reinforced with the same carbon lattice structures as their buildings. As she slid free, a massive secondary explosion rocked the floor below us. Time to bug out, I said, scooping her up in my arms. The maintenance shaft, she whispered, her head resting against my chest. Her skin felt like cool velvet, humming with a faint rhythmic vibration. Left at the next junction. It leads to the drainage tunnels. The guards. They will expect us at the main gate. You're awfully helpful for an alien scientist who just told me to leave her to die, I noted, beginning to run. I am Zilia, she murmured, her golden eyes closing as the pain took over. And I think I have made a very productive mistake in trusting you. Yeah, well, I grunted, dodging a spray of blue sparks. Making mistakes is the most human thing there is. Welcome to the club. The drainage tunnel was 3 kilometers of darkness, knee-deep in gray sludge that smelled of chemicals and old copper. I carried Zilia the whole way, my shoulders screaming and my boots squelching with every heavy step. Every 100 meters I'd stop, press my ear to the cold metal of the tunnel wall, and listen for the rhythmic thrum of Aethel search skiffs. They were up there, I knew it. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the mountain like hungry dragonflies, their thermal scanners trying to pierce the thick canopy of the iron roots. We need to get off the grid, I whispered, more to myself than to her. Zilia stirred in my arms. Her skin had dimmed from sea green to a dull, sickly olive. The silver blood on her forehead had dried into a metallic crust. The thermal. They will see the heat of your heart, Kalen. Not where we're going, I replied. We emerged from the tunnel into a hidden ravine, the air crisp and biting. I led us through a narrow crevice in the rock face, a passage so tight I had to turn sideways, shielding Zilia's body with my own. On the other side lay the ghost cache, a decommissioned Cold War-era bunker I'd spent 5 years converting into a sanctuary. The heavy steel door groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of old paper and gun oil. I laid Zilia down on a cot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What is this place? She asked, her golden eyes darting around the room, taking in the stacks of canned food, the racks of mechanical tools, and the old maps of Earth pinned to the walls. There is no frequency here, no signal. Lead lining and 300 meters of granite, I said, stripping off my burnt jacket. This is the only place on Ethelgard where the central mind can't hear you think. It's a dead zone, a ghost home. I moved to a medical cabinet and pulled out a first aid kit that predated the Aethel arrival by 20 years. I didn't have their fancy dermal regenerators or molecular sutures. I had antiseptic, gauze, and a needle. I need to clean that wound, I said, kneeling beside her. It's going to sting. I don't know how your people handle pain without the neural weave. We don't, she whispered, her fingers clutching the rough fabric of the cot. Pain is considered an inefficient biological output. It is suppressed at the source. Well, consider this an education in inefficiency, I muttered, dabbing a cloth in alcohol. As the liquid touched her skin, she let out a sharp, hissing breath, her body tensing. Her hand shot out, grabbing my forearm with surprising strength. Her grip was cold, but the energy radiating from her was intense, a shimmering, tactile sensation that made the hair on my arm stand up. Your mind, she gasped, her eyes locking onto mine. It is so loud, chaotic, like a storm that never breaks. That's just called thinking for yourself, Zilia. You should try it sometime. I worked in silence for a while, stitching the jagged gash on her forehead with practiced hands. Despite the alien color of her blood and the shimmer of her skin, the anatomy beneath wasn't so different. A heart that beat too fast, lungs that struggled for air, and a spirit that seemed to be fracturing under the weight of something much heavier than a fallen beam. Why did you do it? She asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet of the bunker. You risk everything. You are a ghost. You have spent years hiding from us. Why save a member of the race that took your world? I tied off the last stitch and stepped back, looking at her. The light of a single kerosene lamp flickered between us, casting long, dancing shadows. Because I remember what it was like, I said, my voice low. Before the harmony. My mother was one of the first to be optimized. She had stage 4 lung cancer. They cured her in an hour. But when she came home, she wasn't my mother anymore. She was a puppet. She had the same smile for a sunny day as she did for the news of her own brother's death. She was perfect, and she was dead inside. I turned away, putting the medical supplies back in the cabinet. I don't save people for the Aethel. I save them because I refuse to let death, or your version of perfection, be the only thing left on this planet. Zelia sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. She reached into a hidden pocket of her shimmering lab coat and pulled out a small hexagonal crystal. It glowed with an inner, pulsing light, a deep, violet hue that felt heavy in the air. This is why the spire was destroyed, she said, holding it out. It was not an accident. I caused the overload to prevent the archons from accessing this data. What's on it? I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The truth about the neural weave, she replied, her golden eyes reflecting the violet glow of the crystal. You think we are here to guide you, to cure you. But the weave is not a medicine, Kaelin. It is a harvesting tool. I walked over to the desk, leaning my hands on the scarred wood. Harvesting what? Humanity, she said, and for the first time I saw a tear, a drop of pure liquid silver, roll down her green cheek. The Aethel civilization is dying. Our home system was consumed by a black hole 3 centuries ago. We are a race of ghosts inhabiting crystalline shells. We don't need your gold or your oil. We need your consciousness, your capacity for raw, unfiltered emotion. We are packaging your souls into the central mind to use as a processing fuel for our own immortality. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the wind howled through the iron roots, but inside the bunker, the air felt frozen. So the utopia is just a slaughterhouse with better lighting? I said, my voice cracking. The final phase begins in 7 days, Zelia continued, her voice trembling. The total integration. Every human on Earth will be uploaded. The bodies will be recycled for biological raw materials. There will be no one left to remember what it was like to be free. I looked at the old, tattered map of Earth on the wall. I thought of the billions of people in the cities, smiling their artificial smiles, waiting for their own execution. How do we stop it? I asked, turning back to her. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp anger that felt like a blade in my hand. The paradox code, she said, gesturing to the crystal. It is a flaw I built into the primary architecture. If we can upload it to the central relay in Zenith City, it will trigger a global disconnect. The weaves will dissolve. People will wake up. And the Aethel? They will lose their fuel. They will have to face the truth of their own end, or learn to live as equals without the theft of souls. She looked at me, her golden eyes searching mine. But Zenith City is the most heavily guarded place on the planet. Even for a ghost, it is a suicide mission. I reached out and took the crystal from her hand. It felt warm, vibrating with the collective hope of a billion stolen lives. Well, I said, a grim smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. I've always been a fan of suicide missions. They usually have the best views. Kaelin, she said, her cool fingers brushing against mine. Why do you trust me? I am the enemy. I looked at her, really looked at her, at the silver blood on her brow, the fear in her eyes, and the way her hand trembled, just like mine did. Because you're crying silver, I said, and as far as I know, puppets don't cry. The alarm on my perimeter sensor began to chirp, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the moment. On the small, graining monitor by the door, I saw them. Not peacekeepers. Something worse. The hounds, specialized Aethel hunters designed to track the biosignatures of the unlinked. They were 3 kilometers away and closing fast. Time to go, Zelia, I said, grabbing my gear. The reward for saving you just got a whole lot more interesting. What is the reward? She asked, standing up with effort. A chance to die on my own terms, I said, checking the charge on my pulse rifle. And maybe, just maybe, to give everyone else their souls back. Let's move. We stepped out into the night, two shadows against a world of neon white light, beginning a journey that would either save a world or bury it in the cold silence of perfection. The proximity alarm was no longer chirping. It had transitioned into a steady, low-frequency thrum that resonated in the soles of my boots. That was the signature of the hounds. They didn't bark and they didn't growl. They emitted a subsonic pulse that acted like a sonar for bioelectrical patterns. Even with 300 meters of granite above us, they had caught the scent of our heartbeats. We had to move. Now. "Grab the pack, Zilia," I said, my voice tight as I slapped a fresh thermal cell into my pulse rifle. I didn't wait to see if she complied. I was already at the back of the bunker, kicking aside a stack of empty crates to reveal the rusted iron grate of a secondary ventilation shaft. It wasn't a pretty exit, and it certainly wasn't optimized, but it led to the Black Gorge, a vertical slit in the mountain that was too narrow for Aethel skiffs and too unstable for their heavy mechanical walkers. "Are we abandoning the sanctuary?" Zilia asked, her voice hovering on the edge of a frequency that suggested genuine distress. Her skin had flickered to a sharp, nervous lime color. "It's not a sanctuary anymore," I grunted, prying the grate open with a crowbar. "Once the hounds mark a location, they call in the static, the heavy infantry. They'll level this ridge just to make sure they haven't missed a single unlinked cell." I hauled her toward the opening. The shaft was a narrow vertical drop of 50 meters, lined with ancient, crumbling rungs. I could smell the dampness of the deep earth rising from the darkness below. "Can you climb?" I asked, checking my phase shifter one last time. It was sitting at 40% charge. Not ideal for a cross-country sprint through a combat zone, but it would have to do. Zilia looked down into the abyss, her golden eyes wide. "My physical shell is compromised from the spire incident. My motor coordination is currently at 62%. 62% is a passing grade in my book," I said, grabbing her hand. I squeezed it, feeling the strange metallic hum of her pulse. "Look at me. Don't look at the drop. Just move one limb at a time. If you slip, I've got you." I didn't tell her that if she fell, she'd likely take me with her. In the rescue business, you don't lead with the risks. You lead with the hope. That was the first lesson my father ever taught me on the north face of the iron roots. I went first, my boots finding purchase on the slick iron. Zilia followed, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a novice. Above us, the heavy sound of a thermal breach charge echoed through the bunker's main door. The static had arrived. "Down!" I hissed. We descended into the belly of the mountain, the air growing colder and thicker with the scent of wet slate. 10 meters down, the bunker above exploded. The shockwave rattled the shaft, sending a shower of dust and rust down upon us. Zilia let out a sharp, crystalline gasp, her fingers slipping from a rung. I caught her by the waist, pinning her against the wall of the shaft. My muscles burned, the weight of her alien-reinforced frame taxing my grip. We hung there in the suffocating dark, two heartbeats against a mountain of silence. "Stay with me, Zilia," I whispered, my mouth close to the sea-green curve of her ear. "We're almost at the bottom." I felt her nod against my shoulder. The vibration of her skin was frantic, a staccato rhythm that spoke of a terror she wasn't designed to process. The Aethel were supposed to be above this, above fear, above the messy, visceral reality of survival. But here she was, shivering in the dark, clinging to a human ghost because she had nowhere else to turn. We reached the base of the shaft 15 minutes later. It opened into a natural cavern, the floor covered in a layer of fine white silt. This was the Black Gorge. Outside, the sky would be beginning to bleed into the pre-dawn gray, but in here, time was a fluid concept. I checked my tactical display, a piece of scavenged tech that mapped the local terrain using old-world satellite data. We were 5 kilometers from the nearest Aethel monitoring post, but the hounds would be descending the shaft within minutes. They were relentless. "We need to hit the slip," I said, pointing toward a narrow ledge that clung to the side of a massive underground waterfall. "Is that the most efficient route?" Zilia asked, wiping silver fluid from her cheek. Her luminescence was fading again, her skin taking on the gray hue of the surrounding stone. It's the most dangerous, I replied, checking my rifle's sights, which means the Aethel algorithms will calculate it as a 0% probability path. Their drones won't scan it, and their static won't follow. They hate variables they can't predict. And you, Kalen, are you a variable? I'm a rescue specialist who's currently trying to save an alien princess from her own people, I said, allowing a small, grim smile to touch my lips. I think I passed variable about 4 light years ago. The slip was a nightmare of wet rock and vertical drops. We moved like shadows, pressed against the cold granite as the thunder of the waterfall drowned out our breathing. I used my climbing rope to tether us together, a physical bond that felt more real than any neural weave. Twice, Zilia nearly lost her footing. Each time the rope snapped taut, the weight of her life yanking at my harness. I pulled her back every time, my hands raw and bleeding, my teeth gritted against the strain. "Why?" she asked during a brief moment of rest, sheltered by a rocky overhang. "Why do you exert so much biological energy for a creature that is not of your kind? It is not logical." "It's not about logic, Zelia," I said, watching the entrance of the gorge for any sign of blue light. "It's about being human. We don't leave people behind, not even the ones who tried to take our souls." She reached out, her cool green fingers touching a jagged scar on my forearm, the one I'd earned during a rock slide 3 years ago. "This mark, it is a record of failure?" "It's a record of a rescue," I corrected her. "A tourist couple got stuck on a ledge. I had to brace a falling boulder while they crawled out. It hurt like hell, and it left this. But they lived." Zilia traced the scar with a delicacy that felt almost sacred. "In my world, this would have been erased. It would be considered an error in the physical shell. But you wear it like a badge. Because it reminds me that I'm real," I said. "Perfection doesn't have a history. It doesn't have a story. It just exists. Humans. We're made of stories. Most of them are messy, and most of them have scars. A distant howl, not human, not animal, but a digital screech, echoed down the gorge. The hounds had found the shaft. "Time to bug out," I said, hauling myself to my feet. "We've got 3 kilometers of vertical climb before we hit the surface. If we don't make it before sunrise, the skips will catch us in the open." As we began the final ascent, I realized something. I wasn't just rescuing Zelia anymore. I was rescuing the idea that some things are worth the pain. Some things are worth the struggle, even when the odds are 1,000 to 1. We emerged from the gorge just as the first light of dawn touched the peaks of the iron roots. The world below was a sea of clouds, pierced only by the shimmering, white needles of the Aethel spires. Somewhere in that sea of perfection, 1 billion souls were waiting to be woken up. "Look," Zelia said, pointing toward the horizon. 2 Aethel search skiffs were hovering over my old cabin, their blue beams incinerating the remains of my home. My life, my memories, my sanctuary, it was all going up in ionized plasma. "I'm sorry, Kalen," she whispered. "Don't be," I said, adjusting my pack. "It was just a house. We've got a world to win back." We turned away from the burning ridge and headed north, toward the dead zones, the ruins of the old cities where the Aethel didn't dare to go. It was a long way to Zenith City, and the hounds were still on our trail. But for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I felt like I was hunting. The transition from the mountain wilderness to the dead zones was like stepping through a portal into a ghost story. One moment we were surrounded by the scent of pine and wet earth. The next we were walking through the skeletal remains of a metropolis that had once held 5 million people. This was New York, or what was left of it. The Aethel called it Sector 42, a designated ruin left to decay as a reminder of human inefficiency. They didn't bother patrolling here. There was nothing to harvest, and the structural instability of the skyscrapers made it a logistical nightmare for their drones. It was the perfect place for a ghost and an alien rebel to disappear. The streets were canyons of rusted steel and cracked asphalt, reclaimed by ivy and wild mutated weeds. Massive glass towers leaned against each other like weary giants, their windows long ago shattered into 1,000,000 glittering teeth. "Why did they leave this?" Celia asked, her voice hushed. She was walking with more confidence now, her sea-green skin regaining some of its luminescence in the shadows of the ruins. "To the Aethel, This is a waste of planetary surface. It's a monument, I said, stepping over a rusted car chassis that had been stripped of everything valuable. They want the people in the cities to look out from their perfect towers and see this. It's a way of saying, this is what you were before we saved you. This is the chaos you can't go back to. Xylia stopped in front of a faded billboard. It showed a family laughing on a beach, the colors bleached by decades of sun and rain. The text was mostly gone, but the word home was still visible in a cheerful mid-century font. They looked happy, she murmured. Without the neural weave? They were human, I said. We were happy, sad, angry, and bored all at the same time. It was a mess, Xylia, but it was our mess. We found shelter in the remains of an old public library. The roof had partially collapsed, letting in shafts of dusty sunlight that illuminated rows of rotting books. It felt like a temple to a forgotten god. I set up a perimeter of motion sensors, low-tech stuff that wouldn't trigger an Aethel scan, and started a small, smokeless fire in a corner. Xylia sat on a pile of old encyclopedias, the violet light of the paradox crystal casting strange patterns across the room. We need a sit rep, I said, pulling out a map of Zenith City. The city is built on a floating platform 3 kilometers above the ruins of Chicago. It's powered by a central core that feeds into the global neural weave. If we want to upload the paradox code, we have to get into the core chamber. The security is beyond anything your species has ever encountered, Xylia said, her eyes fixed on the crystal. There are biometric locks, neural frequency scanners, and a direct link to the High Archon's personal guard. Even if we get past the perimeter, we cannot bypass the final lock without both a human and an Aethel signature. I looked at my hand, calloused, scarred, and stained with the grime of the dead zone. Then I looked at her, ethereal, glowing, and born from a civilization that looked at us like ants. So it's a 2-key system, I said, the most ancient security measure in the book. They didn't think anyone would ever cooperate. They didn't think anyone would ever feel the need to, she replied. The Aethel believe we have reached the end of history, that we have perfected the universe. Why would anyone want to change perfection? Because perfection is a lie, Xylia. It's a cage with golden bars. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning my equipment. The silence of the library was heavy, filled with the ghosts of a million stories that no one would ever read again. Xylia was watching me, her golden eyes curious and slightly troubled. Kalen? Yeah? Tell me about your father. You said he housed the madness of the old world. I paused, my fingers tracing the cold metal of my rifle. My father was a stubborn old man. When the Aethel arrived, he was the first one to say that the gifts were a trap. He refused the weave, even when the peacekeepers came to his door. They didn't force him, not at first. They just waited. They cut off his power, his water, his access to the medical centers. And he didn't give in? Never. He told me that a man who trades his pain for a comfortable lie isn't a man anymore. He's just a house for someone else's thoughts. He died in the mountains, freezing and hungry, but he died with his own mind. That was his victory. Xylia looked down at her hands. My father is the High Archon, the one who designed the harvesting. The weight of that sentence hit me like a physical blow. The High Archon? You're the daughter of the man who's trying to erase humanity? I was his pride, she whispered, his most perfect creation. He gave me the responsibility of the linguistic coding because he believed I was the only one who could truly understand the nuance of the human spirit enough to effectively suppress it. She looked up at me, silver tears shimmering in the firelight. But he was wrong. The more I studied your language, your poetry, your songs of loss and longing, the more I realized that what we were doing was a crime. I didn't find the weakness he wanted me to exploit. I found the beauty he wanted me to destroy. I moved across the small space between us and sat down beside her. I didn't know what to say. In my world, she was the enemy. She was the architect of our enslavement. But looking at her now, I didn't see an Aethel scientist. I saw someone who had made a choice that cost her everything. You're not your father, Xylia, and you're not the Aethel. You're just you. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. Her skin felt warmer now, more human. The hum of her pulse was steady, a rhythmic vibration that felt like a song. I am afraid, Kalen. For the first time in my existence, the future is a void. I cannot see the outcome. Welcome to being human, I said, putting an arm around her. It was a gesture of comfort I hadn't used in 10 years. It felt strange, and it felt right. None of us can see the outcome. We just make our choices and hope they're the right ones. We stayed like that for a long time, watching the fire die down to glowing embers. Outside, the shadows of the dead zone lengthened, and the distant electronic hum of the world above felt like a fading dream. I'm glad I pulled you from the fire, I said softly. Celia didn't answer with words. She just squeezed my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. A sudden, sharp ping from the motion sensors shattered the peace. I was on my feet in a second, rifle leveled at the darkness of the library's main hall. The sensors were showing a cluster of heat signatures, small, fast, and radiating a low-frequency hum. "Hounds," Zelia whispered, her skin flickering to a defensive amber. "No," I said, squinting through my thermal scope. "Too small, too uncoordinated." A group of figures emerged from the shadows. They weren't Aethel. They were humans, but they weren't like the optimized citizens of the cities. They were dressed in rags and scavenged armor, their faces smeared with grease and ash. They carried primitive weapons, spears tipped with Aethel alloy and old-world firearms that looked like they hadn't been fired in decades. "Scavengers?" Zelia asked. "Worse," I muttered. "The unlinked, but not the kind that hide. These are the ones who went feral. They call themselves the Iron Eaters. They hate the Aethel, and they don't much care for ghosts either." The leader of the group, a man with a jagged scar across his throat and eyes that burned with a manic intensity, stepped forward. He sniffed the air, his gaze landing on Zelia. "Green skin," he rasped, his voice sounding like two stones rubbing together. "A pretty little lizard in our den." "Back off," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "We're just passing through." The man laughed, a dry hacking sound. "Nothing passes through the dead zone for free, Ghost, especially not a piece of Aethel royalty. Do you have any idea what her biomatter is worth on the black market? One of her eyes could buy us a year's worth of clean water." I shifted my rifle, aiming it squarely at his chest. "You touch her, and you'll be dead before you can blink." The Iron Eaters began to circle us, their movements fluid and predatory. There were at least a dozen of them, and my pulse rifle only had 10 shots left in the cell. This is foobar, I thought, my mind racing through the options. "Wait." Celia stepped forward, the paradox crystal held high in her hand. Its violet light illuminated the library, casting long, menacing shadows across the ruins. "If you kill us, you kill the only chance this world has to be free. This crystal contains the code to break the neural weave." The leader paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the glowing gem. "Free? Why would we want to be free? We like it here in the dirt. No rules, no harmony, just us." "Is that what you call this?" I snapped, gesturing to the ruins. "Living in the trash of a civilization that treats you like a pest? You're not free. You're just waiting for the exterminator." The man's face twisted in anger. He raised a rusted machete. "Maybe so, but at least I'll die with a full stomach tonight." Just as he was about to charge, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the high-pitched melodic whine of an Aethel skip. A blue searchlight swept through the shattered windows of the library, illuminating the room in a cold, clinical glare. "Static," Zelia hissed. "They found us." The Iron Eaters froze, their feral bravado vanishing in the face of the Aethel technology. The skip was hovering just outside the library, its echo pulse cannons charging with a sound like a rising scream. "We need to go," I shouted, grabbing Zelia's arm. "What about them?" she asked, looking at the terrified scavengers. "They made their choice," I yelled over the roar of the skip. But I looked back at the leader, the man with the scarred throat. He was standing paralyzed in the blue light, a relic of a broken world facing its final judgment. "Damn it," I muttered. I grabbed a flashbang from my belt and tossed it toward the library's entrance. The explosion was a blinding white wall of light, momentarily dazzling the skip's sensors. "Follow me," I roared to the Iron Eaters. "If you want to live, get into the basement." The scavengers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled toward the hidden hatch I'd spotted earlier, their fear overriding their greed. Zillia and I dived behind a heavy stone pillar just as the skip opened fire. A bolt of echo pulse energy slammed into the spot where we'd been standing, disintegrating the library's checkout desk into a cloud of fine white dust. "We can't stay here," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We have to hit the subway tunnels. It's the only way to Zenith City." The skip was turning, its searchlight cutting through the dust. We were trapped in a corner, with 100 meters of open floor between us and the basement hatch. "Phase shifter," Zillia said, pointing to the device on my belt. "It's only at 20%, I said. "It'll only last for 10 seconds. 10 seconds is all we need," she replied, her golden eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Hold my hand, Kaylin." I grabbed her hand, feeling the metallic hum of her pulse merge with the frantic rhythm of my own. I slammed the thumb stud on the phase shifter. The world turned into a gray smear of desynchronized atoms. We ran. The echo pulse bolts passed through us like harmless light, the Aethel technology unable to lock onto our fluctuating biosignatures. We sprinted across the library floor, our feet barely touching the silt, the skip's roar sounding like a distant, frustrated beast. We reached the hatch just as the phase shifter died. I yanked the iron door open and shoved Zillia through, diving in after her as the skip's second volley leveled the stone pillar we'd been hiding behind. We tumbled down a long concrete slide, landing in the damp, cold darkness of the old subway tunnels. Above us, the sounds of the battle faded, replaced by the heavy rhythmic dripping of water and the distant scuttle of rats. We were safe. For now. I looked at Zillia in the darkness, her skin glowing with a faint, exhausted light. Her hand was still in mine, her fingers gripped tight. "Nice move," I said, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "You were right, Kaylin," she whispered, her voice echoing in the tunnel. "Some things are worth the struggle." I looked down at our joined hands, the human ghost and the Aethel rebel, lost in the bowels of a dead world. We were 100 miles from Zenith City, hunted by an empire of perfection, and led by a code that might destroy everything. But as we started walking into the darkness, I realized that for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't just a rescue specialist. I was a man on a mission, and I wasn't alone. The subway tunnels were a labyrinth of rusted tracks and rotting train cars, a subterranean city that had once pulsed with the life of 1,000 commuters. Now it was just a graveyard of steel, but to me, it was a highway. We walked for hours, our footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. Zillia stayed close, her luminescence acting as a natural lantern. She was quiet, her mind clearly occupied by the data on the paradox crystal. "Kaylin?" she asked after a long period of silence. "Yeah, if we succeed, if the neural weave is broken." "What happens next? Millions of your people will be overwhelmed by the return of their emotions. They will feel the pain of their illnesses, the grief of their losses, the reality of their lives. It will be chaos." I stopped and looked at her, the violet light of the crystal reflected in her golden eyes. "It will be the most beautiful chaos the world has ever seen," I said, "because it will be theirs. They'll have to learn to walk again, Zillia. They'll have to learn to feel, to hurt, and to heal. It won't be easy. A lot of them won't make it. But at least they'll be real." She nodded slowly, the logic of her people warring with the empathy she discovered in the ruins. "You are a strange species, Kaylin Varro. You would trade a perfect, painless existence for a life of suffering and scars." "It's not the suffering we want," I said, starting to walk again. "It's the choice. Without the choice to be miserable, you can't have the choice to be happy. You can't have one without the other. That's the bargain of being human." Zillia reached out and touched the scarred wall of the subway tunnel. "I think I am beginning to understand. The Aethel forgot the bargain. We thought we could have the light without the shadow, and in doing so, we became shadows ourselves. We continued our journey into the dark, two variables in an equation that was about to change the universe. Above us, Zenith City waited, a fortress of light and logic. But down here in the cold and the grime, the heart of humanity was still beating, and it was louder than ever. The path ahead was long, and the hounds were still out there, somewhere in the dark. But as I looked at Zillia, I knew that the climb was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't just rescuing one person. I was bringing the whole world home. The subway tunnel eventually widened into a massive hub, an old transfer station where four lines converge. It was a cavernous space, the ceiling supported by rows of heavy steel pillars. In the center of the hub, a group of people were gathered around a fire built from old wooden transit ties. The Iron Eaters? Zelia whispered, her skin dimming. No, I said, squinting. These weren't scavengers. They were organized. They had sentries posted at every tunnel entrance, and their weapons were modern. Scavenged Aethel tech modified with human ingenuity. This was the resistance. The unlinked underground, I muttered, lowering my rifle. I'd heard rumors of them for years, but I'd always thought they were just a ghost story. A figure stepped out from behind a pillar, a woman with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. She carried a modified Echo pulse rifle, and her eyes were sharp and unforgiving. Voss, she said, her voice a low growl. I heard you were dead. I know you, I asked, keeping my hand near my sidearm. You saved my daughter 5 years ago, she said, nodding toward a young woman standing near the fire. Sarah Keller. You pulled her out of a collapsed medical center in the Sector 5. I remembered the girl, a 10-year-old with wide eyes and a crushed leg. I'd spent 6 hours digging her out while the Aethel drones hovered overhead, waiting for her to die so they could recycle her biometrics. Captain Miller, I said, the name coming back to me. You were with the old National Guard. Miller stepped into the light, her gaze shifting to Zelia. And who's the green skin? A souvenir from the spire? She's with me, I said, stepping in front of Zelia, and she's the reason we're all going to be free by the end of the week. Miller's eyebrows shot up. Free? That's a big word for a man who lives in a hole in the ground, Voss. She has the paradox code, I said, gesturing to the crystal. We're going to Zenith City. We're going to shut down the neural weave. The hub went silent. The resistance fighters looked at each other, their faces a mix of disbelief and sudden, desperate hope. Zenith City, Miller said, her voice skeptical. That's a one-way trip, Voss. I know, I said, looking at Zelia, but it's the only trip left worth taking. Miller looked at Zelia, then at me, and finally at her daughter, who was watching us from the fire. She sighed, the weight of the war visible in the sag of her shoulders. Well, she said, checking her rifle's charge, if you're crazy enough to try it, I guess we're crazy enough to help you get to the elevator. I looked at Zelia and saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't logic. It was solidarity. We rested in the resistance hub for 3 hours, eating scavenged rations that tasted like sawdust and drinking water that had a faint metallic tang. Miller and her team were busy preparing for the assault on the Zenith City elevator, a massive, high-speed lift that connected the ruins of Chicago to the floating platform above. It's going to be a bloodbath, Miller said, spreading a tactical map across a rusted crate. The elevator is guarded by a full battalion of static. They've got automated turrets and aerial support. Even with everything we've got, we'll only be able to buy you a few minutes. That's all we need, I said, studying the map. Once we're in the elevator, Zelia can override the controls. We'll be in the city before they can shut it down. And then what? Miller asked. You'll be in the heart of the beast, Voss. Just the two of you. Then we do what we do best, I said. We finish the rescue. As we prepared to leave, Zelia approached Sarah, the girl I'd saved years ago. Sarah was sitting by the fire, sharpening a piece of Aethel alloy into a knife. You are not afraid? Zelia asked, her voice soft. Sarah looked up, her face lit by the orange glow of the fire. I'm terrified, she said simply. But I remember what my mom told me. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done even when your heart is trying to jump out of your chest. Zelia nodded, her skin pulsing with a warm, sympathetic light. That is a very human sentiment. Sarah smiled, a real, messy, beautiful smile. Yeah, it is. We left the hub at 2200 hours, moving through the tunnels like a small, determined army. Miller and her fighters led the way, their movements silent and professional. Zelia and I followed, the paradox crystal glowing between us like a promise. As we approached the elevator terminal, the air began to hum with the immense energy of the Aethel technology. The darkness of the tunnels was replaced by the cold blue glow of the static's floodlights. "This is it," Miller whispered, signaling her team to spread out. "Once the shooting starts, you two run for the main doors. Don't look back." I looked at Zelia. She was pale, her fingers clutching the crystal, but her eyes were steady. "Ready?" I asked. "Ready," she replied. I gripped my rifle, the cold metal feeling like an extension of my own arm. I thought of my father, of the library, of the scars on my skin, and the billion souls waiting to be woken up. I thought of the choice. "Open fire!" Miller roared. The darkness erupted into a chaos of blue and white light. The resistance fighters charged, their scavenged weapons screaming as they met the Aethel static in a clash of two worlds. We ran. The air was filled with the smell of ozone and the sound of screams. Some human, some digital. I fired my rifle as we sprinted across the open tarmac, the blue bolts of the static's turrets stitching a deadly pattern in the ground at our feet. "Zelia!" I shouted, grabbing her waist as a piece of shrapnel whistled past her head. "I am here!" she cried, her skin glowing brighter than the floodlights. We reached the elevator doors just as a heavy static walker rounded the corner, its massive cannons leveling at us. "Zelia, the code!" I roared, slamming my back against the doors to shield her. Her fingers danced across the Aethel interface, her luminescence syncing with the machine's frequency. The doors groaned, then slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. We dived inside just as the walker fired. The blast slammed into the elevator's exterior, the force of it throwing us against the far wall. The doors hissed shut. Zelia scrambled to the control panel, her fingers a blur of green light. The elevator began to rise, the sudden G-force pinning us to the floor. "We're in," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged, metallic sobs. I pulled myself up, looking out through the reinforced glass of the elevator car. Below us, the battle at the terminal was a tiny flickering speck of light in the vast darkness of the ruins. Miller, Sarah, the Resistance, they were down there, fighting for a world they might never see. I looked up. Above us, the floating lights of Zenith City were growing closer, a glittering paradise built on the theft of souls. "We're coming for you," I whispered. The elevator continued its ascent, a tiny metal box carrying the fate of a world. I reached out and took Zelia's hand, our fingers intertwining one last time before the final storm. We were 100 miles from the ground, 3 kilometers from the core, and 0 miles from the truth. The rescue was just beginning. The ascent was a silent, gut-wrenching climb through the clouds. As the elevator car pierced the atmospheric layer surrounding Zenith City, the grime and rust of the dead zones vanished, replaced by a world of terrifying, luminous white. Looking out the reinforced glass, I watched the ruins of Chicago shrink until they were nothing but a dark smudge on the Earth's surface. Above us, the floating platform of the Aethel capital expanded like a blossoming lily made of diamond and light. It was 3 kilometers from the ground to the docking bay, and every meter felt like a betrayal of the dirt I'd spent my life protecting. "Kaylin," Zelia whispered, her hand trembling in mine. Her skin was a frantic, pulsing indigo. "The frequency, it is so strong here. The central mind, it is calling to my resonance. It wants to repair the error of my descent." I squeezed her hand, my own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt the sweat slicking my palms, the sour taste of adrenaline in the back of my throat. I was terrified. Not the kind of fear you feel when a rock ledge crumbles beneath your boots. That's sharp, immediate, and honest. This was a cold, creeping dread. It was the fear of being swallowed by a world where my fear wouldn't even be allowed to exist. "Don't listen to it," I said, my voice sounding like gravel in a world of silk. "Focus on the pain in your leg. Focus on the heat of my hand. Stay messy, Zelia. Stay broken." The elevator hissed to a halt at 3,400 meters. The doors didn't just open, they dissolved into a mist of microscopic nanites. Beyond them lay a docking bay that looked more like an art gallery than a transit hub. The air smelled of nothing, not ozone, not dust, not even oxygen. It was an absence of scent that made my lungs ache for a breath of mountain air. Dozens of optimized humans moved through the hall. They didn't walk. They drifted with a synchronized grace that made my skin crawl. No one bumped into anyone else. No one looked hurried. Their faces were smooth, devoid of the wrinkles of worry or the lines of laughter. They were beautiful, and they were utterly hollow. "Keep your head down," I muttered, pulling my cowl lower. My ghost cloak was supposed to scramble my biosignature, but in this much light, I felt like a charcoal smudge on a white canvas. "Move like you've got a purpose, but don't look 'em in the eye." We began to navigate the terminal, heading toward the secondary maintenance corridor Zilia had identified on the map. We were skating on thin ice, every second a gamble that the local sensors wouldn't pick up the discordance of my heartbeat. "Halt!" a voice resonated. It wasn't a shout. It was a perfectly modulated chime that originated from a peacekeeper standing near a fountain of liquid light. Its crystalline armor was etched with gold filigree, a mark of the High Archon's personal guard. "Identification required for the unlinked entity," the guard said, its amethyst eyes fixed on me. "And the scientist, researcher Xylia? You are marked for metabolic recalibration. Your presence in this sector is outside of the projected schedule." Xylia stepped forward, her skin shifting to a brittle, translucent green. She stood tall, her voice regaining the haughty cadence of an Aethel aristocrat. "I am conducting a field study on the physiological degradation of the ghost caste. This specimen is under my direct supervision. My schedule has been adjusted by the High Archon's mandate. Do you intend to cross-examine my father's intent?" The guard paused. I could practically hear its processors whirring as it weighed the logic of her statement against the data in the central mind. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. I kept my hand on the hilt of my combat knife, hidden beneath my cloak. If I had to move, I'd have to be fast, faster than any human had ever been. "Your authorization is anomalous," the guard replied, "but the bloodline signature is valid. Proceed to the medical wing for validation within 20 minutes. 20 minutes was a lifetime. "Copy that," I whispered under my breath as we moved past. Once we were inside the maintenance shaft, I let out a breath I'd been holding since the clouds. "That was some high-grade acting, Xylia. You almost had me believing you were back on the payroll." "I was not acting, Kaelin," she said, leaning against the wall. Her skin was dimming, the indigo replaced by a sickly, exhausted gray. "I was using the only weapon I have left, the arrogance of my people. But the central mind, it knows. It is probing the edges of my consciousness. It is like 1,000 cold needles trying to find a gap in my resolve." We reached a junction where the white alloy gave way to more functional, industrial structures. This was the spine of Zenith City, the place where the gravity generators and atmosphere scrubbers hummed with a low-frequency power. "The core is 1 kilometer ahead," Xylia said, checking a holographic projection from her wrist. "But the route is blocked by a series of frequency gates. To pass them, we will have to desynchronize the local grid. And how do we do that without screaming, 'We are here,' to every clanker in the city?" I asked, checking the charge on my phase shifter. It was down to 15%. "There is a substation near the cooling vents," she said. "If we can introduce a feedback loop into the thermal regulators, the gates will cycle into safe mode for 60 seconds. It will create a distraction. 60 seconds. 1 minute to cross a kilometer of high-security territory." "Sounds like a Tuesday in the rescue business," I grunted. "Let's move." As we crept through the shadows of the machinery, I watched the optimized humans through the transparent floor panels above. They were gathered in a massive plaza, hundreds of them standing in perfect, concentric circles. They weren't talking. They weren't doing anything. They were just receiving. "What are they doing?" I asked. "They are undergoing the midday synchronization," Xylia whispered. "The central mind is harmonizing their emotional states, smoothing out any ripples of dissent or anxiety. It is a moment of total peace. It looks like a mass funeral," I said. "In a way it is," she replied. We reached the substation, a hum of massive capacitors that made the air vibrate with static electricity. I stood guard while Xylia began to interface with the controls. Her fingers moved with a frantic precision, her skin pulsing in sync with the machines. "Kaelin, I need you to brace the manual override," she said, pointing to a heavy iron lever that looked like it belonged in an old-world factory. "When I trigger the loop, the pressure will try to kick it back. If it closes, the feedback will travel into the core and incinerate us." I grabbed the lever, planting my boots on the slick floor. I've held up rock slides, Zilia. I think I can handle a little pressure. Are you sure? She asked, looking at me with those golden eyes. If you do this, there is no turning back. The alarm will trigger the hounds within seconds. You will be acting against the logic of survival. I thought of Sarah Keller and her scarred leg. I thought of my father's frozen body in the mountains. I thought of the library and the ghosts of a billion books. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, and my hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the iron. I'm terrified, Zelia, I said, giving her a jagged, honest smile. My heart's trying to jump out of my chest, and that's how I know I'm still the man for the job. Do it. She slammed her hand onto the console. The substation erupted into a scream of protesting metal. The lever kicked back with the force of a freight train, nearly snapping my wrists. I roared, throwing my entire weight against the iron, my muscles tearing as I fought the surge of energy. Blue sparks rained down from the ceiling, stinging my skin, but I didn't let go. The gates! I yelled through the roar of the feedback. Go! Zelia sprinted toward the corridor, the frequency gates flickering and dying as the grid buckled under the load. I held the lever for 10, 20, 30 seconds, my vision blurring with the effort. 40 seconds. 50 seconds, I felt the phase shifter on my belt hum, a warning that the local reality was beginning to fracture around the feedback loop. Now, Kaylin! Celia screamed from the far end of the hall. I let go of the lever and dived. The substation exploded behind me in a wave of white heat. I rolled across the floor, the phase shifter flickering into life for a fraction of a second, just enough to shield me from the worst of the blast. I scrambled into the corridor just as the frequency gates slammed back into place, sealing us off from the explosion. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my arms feeling like they'd been pulled through a meat grinder. That was close, I wheezed. Celia knelt beside me, her skin a warm, glowing emerald. You did it. You held the line. Yeah, well, I muttered, pulling myself up. Don't tell my therapist. I'm supposed to be avoiding high-stress situations. We were in. The core chamber lay just ahead, a massive dome of shimmering white alloy that pulsed with the heartbeat of Aethel. But the victory was short-lived. A sound echoed through the hall, a heavy, rhythmic clanging of metal on metal. It was a sound I knew from my nightmares. Hounds? Zelia whispered. No, I said, pointing my rifle at the far end of the corridor. Worse. Commander Crix, the High Archon's chief enforcer, stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't like the other peacekeepers. He was larger, his armor a matte black that seemed to swallow the light. In his hand, he carried a heavy echo blade, a weapon that could vibrate through solid steel. A spectacular display of primitive resilience, Crix said, his voice a deep, resonant chime that felt like a physical weight in the air. Researcher Zelia, your father is disappointed. He had hoped your curiosity would have its limits. My father's disappointment is a small price for the world's freedom, Crix, Zelia said, her voice steady. Freedom is a chaotic variable that leads to extinction, Crix replied, raising his blade. Order is the only mercy, and I am here to deliver it. I stepped in front of Zelia, my rifle leveled at the commander's chest. You want mercy, Clanker? Try a little human intervention. Crix moved with a speed that defied logic. He didn't run, he blurred. The battle for the soul of the world had begun. Crix was a hurricane of matte black metal and vibrating energy. His echo blade hissed through the air, leaving trails of distorted space in its wake. I dived to the left, the blade missing my shoulder by less than an inch, the sheer vibration of the near miss making my collarbone ache. Get to the console, Zelia! I roared, firing a burst of pulse energy at the commander's legs. The bolt splashed harmlessly against Crix's kinetic shielding. He didn't even flinch. He swiped his hand in a wide arc, sending a wave of concussive force that threw me against a row of cooling pipes. My rifle clattered to the floor, out of reach. I groaned, my ribs feeling like they'd been kicked in by a mule. I saw Zelia sprinting toward the central dais of the core, her fingers already working on the paradox crystal. Kaylin! She screamed as Crix turned his attention to her. The commander raised his blade for a killing blow. He didn't care about the crystal, he cared about eliminating the variable. I scrambled to my feet, my hand finding a heavy, discarded cooling rod. I didn't have a rifle. I didn't have a shield. All I had was a piece of pipe and a heart that was currently trying to punch its way out of my chest. "Hey, black and shiny!" I yelled, charging at the commander. "Over here!" Crick spun, his amethyst eyes glowing with a cold, analytical light. "Your persistence is statistically insignificant, Ghost. You are choosing a painful termination over a peaceful transition. Why? Because I like the way it feels to stay standing." I roared, swinging the rod with every ounce of strength I had left. The rod struck Crick's shoulder with a deafening clang. It didn't break his armor, but the impact sent a jolt of kinetic energy through his frame, staggering him for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Cilia slammed the paradox crystal into the core's interface. A shock wave of violet light erupted from the dais, throwing Crick's back and slamming me against the pipes again. The entire chamber began to hum with a new discordant frequency, the sound of two worlds colliding. "The paradox code is uploading," Zilia cried, her skin glowing like a sun. "But the system is fighting back. It needs a human override. Kalen, the final lock." I looked at the console. It was surrounded by a swirling vortex of ionized plasma. To reach it, I'd have to step into the field, a move that would likely incinerate my nervous system. "You cannot do it," Crick said, hauling himself to his feet. His armor was cracked, and one of his eyes had gone dark, leaking black fluid. "The human form cannot withstand the raw data stream of the central mind. You will burn before you reach the key." I looked at Zilia. She was holding the crystal in place, her green skin blistering under the heat of the feedback. She was suffering for a world she barely knew, for a people she had been raised to despise. If she could do it, I could do it. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," I whispered to myself, my voice lost in the roar of the machines. I stepped into the plasma field. It felt like being skinned alive by 1,000 electric needles. Every nerve in my body screamed in protest, my muscles locking up as the raw data of the Aethel network poured into my brain. I saw images of 1,000 years of Aethel history, the black hole that ate their world, the cold logic of their survival, the sterile peace of their empire. And beneath it, I felt the silent, muffled screams of 1 billion human souls, trapped in a dream they never asked for. I reached for the override lever, my hand turning black as the skin charred. I couldn't feel my fingers. I couldn't feel my arm. I was just a vessel of pain and purpose. "Kalen!" Zilia's voice was a distant chime in the storm. "Push!" I gripped the lever with my teeth and my one good hand, throwing my entire soul into the motion. The lever moved. 1 inch, 2 inches. "Stop him!" a voice boomed, not from Crix, but from the air itself. It was the High Archon. His voice was a mountain of gold and ice, a command that should have brought me to my knees. "Human, you are destroying the only thing that keeps your species alive," the Archon roared. "Without the harmony, you will return to the dirt. You will die in the chaos of your own making." "Then we'll die free," I screamed back, my voice tearing my throat. With a final agonizing heave, I slammed the lever home. The world exploded into violet. The frequency gates didn't just open, they shattered. The global neural weave, the invisible web that held 1 billion souls in a gilded cage, began to unravel. Across the planet, the synchronization failed. In Zenith City, the optimized humans stopped their concentric dance. They blinked. They looked at their hands. They felt the first sharp sting of a headache. They felt the weight of their own grief. They felt the heat of the sun on their skin. They woke up. Crix fell to his knees, his matte black armor leaking sparks as the connection to the central mind was severed. His amethyst eyes flickered and died, leaving behind only the cold, empty glass. The plasma field vanished, dropping me to the floor like a sack of broken bones. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. My skin was a roadmap of burns and scars, a record of a rescue that had cost me everything I had left. Zilia was beside me in an instant, her tears of liquid silver falling onto my face. "Kalen? Kalen, stay with me." I looked up at her, my vision blurring. Her skin was a vibrant, beautiful emerald, glowing with a life that was finally her own. Did we win?" I whispered. "We broke the weave," she said, her voice trembling. "The people, they are waking up. It is chaos, Kalen. It is the most beautiful chaos I have ever seen. I managed a weak, jagged smile. Good, but the victory was heavy. Outside the chamber, the sounds of Zenith City were changing. The silent grace was gone, replaced by the sounds of a million people suddenly remembering how to scream, how to cry, and how to fight. The High Archon's voice returned, but it was no longer a mountain. It was just a man, old, tired, and full of a cold, lingering spite. "You have broken the order," he whispered through the speakers, "but you have not saved them. You have only given them the right to suffer. And the Aethel will not go quietly into the night." The platform of Zenith City began to tilt. "He is dropping the city," Zilia gasped, looking at the structural displays. "He is initiating a total purge. He will crash the platform into the ruins to ensure no one survives the awakening." "We have to get to the emergency shuttles," I said, trying to push myself up. My body screamed in protest, but I didn't listen. I had one more rescue to finish. "Can you walk?" Zelia asked, putting my arm over her shoulder. "I can crawl if I have to," I grunted, "but I'd prefer a lift." We began to move through the crumbling halls of the Capitol. The white alloy was cracking, the diamonds of the ceiling falling like rain. Around us, the newly awakened humans were stumbling through the corridors, their faces masks of terror and confusion. I saw a woman huddled in a corner, clutching her head and weeping. I saw a man staring at a wall as if seeing it for the first time. They were broken, they were hurting, and they were finally gloriously real. "This way," I shouted to them, pointing toward the shuttle bay. "Follow the green light." Zilia's skin acted as a beacon, her luminescence guiding the refugees through the collapsing city. We weren't just escaping, we were leading an exodus from a dying paradise. We reached the shuttle bay as the platform hit a 45-degree angle. The massive transport ships were automated, their systems flickering as they struggled to process the paradox code. "Zilia, get them in," I said, shoving a group of survivors toward a shuttle. "I'll hold the doors." "What about you?" she asked, her golden eyes wide with fear. "I'm the rescue specialist, remember?" I said, bracing myself against the shifting floor. "I'm always the last one out." The High Archon's elite guard, the remaining peacekeepers who were still linked to the failing mind, began to descend upon the bay. They were erratic, their movements jerky and desperate, but they were still armed with echo blades. I pulled my combat knife, the cold steel feeling familiar in my hand. I was burned, I was broken, and I was outnumbered. It was the best I'd felt in years. "Go!" I roared at Zilia. "Get them to the ground." She hesitated for a second, her skin pulsing with a deep, mournful indigo. Then she leaned in and kissed me, a brief, electric contact that tasted of silver and salt. "Come back to me, Kalen Varro," she whispered. "Count on it," I said. The shuttle doors hissed shut, and the massive ship ignited its thrusters, blasting away from the falling city. I watched it go, a tiny spark of hope in a collapsing sky. Then I turned to face the guards. The platform of Zenith City gave a final, agonizing groan and began its 3-kilometer plunge toward the earth. I took a deep breath of the freezing, thinning air. My heart was thumping, my lungs were burning, and I was terrified. I was alive. The world had become a vertical nightmare. Zenith City, once the pinnacle of Aethel architectural arrogance, was no longer a floating lily. It was a dying beast, 1 billion tons of white alloy and crystalline glass plunging through the atmosphere at terminal velocity. The air didn't just howl, it screamed a high-pitched metallic dirge as the platform's stabilizers fought a losing battle against the inexorable pull of the Earth. I was pinned against the bulkhead of the main transit hub, my fingers clawing at a structural rib. Gravity had become a fickle mistress, shifting 10 degrees every few seconds as the city tilted and groaned. My skin, or what was left of it after the plasma discharge, was a map of raw, weeping agony. Every breath felt like I was swallowing hot needles. My left arm was a charred, useless weight hanging by my side, but my right hand gripped my combat knife with a white-knuckled intensity that defied my body's urge to just quit and let the darkness take over. The peacekeepers were gone. Without the central mind to choreograph their movements, the remaining guards had become erratic, their mechanical limbs twitching in loops of corrupted logic. They weren't hunting me anymore. They were just glitching, walking into walls or firing their echo blades at empty air. "Help! Please!" The voice was thin, barely audible over the roar of the rushing wind. I looked up, or what was now up, and saw a figure dangling from a shattered glass walkway 50 meters above me. It wasn't an Aethel. It was a human guard, one of the Janissaries. He was wearing the high-tech black armor of the elite guard, but his helmet was gone, revealing a face twisted in a very human, very unoptimized terror. His neural weave had flatlined. He was wide awake, feeling the full, crushing weight of his mortality for the first time in years. "Voss?" he gasped, recognizing me. "It's Jax. Please, don't leave me." I knew Jax. Or rather, I knew the man he had been before the Harmony took him. He'd been a rookie cop in old Chicago, a kid with a bright smile and a habit of sharing his sandwiches with the street dogs. After the optimization, he'd become a silent, efficient killing machine who had hunted my ghost cell for 3 years. He had personally overseen the burning of 2 of our safe houses. In any logical world, Jax was a clanker in human skin. He was the enemy. He was hosed, and the world would be a quieter place without him. "Let him go, Voss," my internal voice hissed, the one that had kept me alive in the mountains for 10 years. "He's a casualty of war. Save your strength. You've got 3 kilometers of air between you and the ground." But then I saw his eyes. They weren't the vacant amethyst glow of the optimized. They were brown, bloodshot, and wet with tears. He was shaking so hard the glass beneath him was cracking. He was terrified. He was a mess. He was human. "Damn it all to hell," I growled, the words tasting like copper. I started to climb. It was a suicidal maneuver. I was using the structural lattice of the hub like a ladder, my one good hand doing the work of 2. Every time the city shuddered, I nearly lost my grip. The wind through the shattered windows was a freezing gale, threatening to peel me off the wall. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Kaylin," I whispered, my father's voice echoing in the back of my skull. "It's doing the right thing while your knees are knocking together." I reached the walkway just as the primary support snapped. Jax let out a yelp as he slid toward the edge. I lunged, my hand catching the strap of his chest plate. The jerk nearly pulled my shoulder out of its socket. I roared, my boots sliding on the slick glass, but I didn't let go. "I've got you!" I screamed over the roar of the descent. "Pull yourself up!" Jax's fingers scrambled for purchase, his eyes wide as he looked at my charred face. You came back. Why? "I tried to kill you, Voss. I burned your people." "Shut up and climb, Jax," I snarled. "We're all having a bad day." With a desperate heave, he rolled onto the ledge, gasping for air. We lay there for a second, 2 specks of life on a falling mountain. The city was glowing now, the friction of the lower atmosphere turning the white alloy into a dull, angry red. "Sit rep, Voss?" Jax wheezed, his training kicking in even through the terror. "We're about 2 minutes from a very loud landing," I said, checking my surroundings. "The emergency grav chutes are at the end of this hall. If the override I pulled worked, they should have enough juice for a one-way trip to the surface." Jax looked at the corridor. It was a furnace of blue sparks and falling debris. "We'll never make it." "We're KIA, Voss. Look at us. You're toasted, and I'm a traitor to a god that's currently falling out of the sky." "Maybe," I said, pushing myself up, "but I've spent 10 years being a ghost, Jax. And if there's one thing a ghost knows how to do, it's haunt the living. Now get on your feet." We moved through the crumbling hallway, a pair of walking wounded. Jax provided the muscle, his armor enhanced strength, allowing him to clear the fallen beams that I couldn't move. I provided the navigation, my rescue instincts finding the path through the smoke and fire. We reached the grav chute bay just as the city entered the cloud layer above the ruins. The ground was visible now, a jagged landscape of rusted steel and gray water. We were coming down right over Lake Michigan. The bay doors were jammed. I hammered the manual release, but it was dead. "Jax, the override!" I shouted. He stepped forward, his black-armored fist slamming into the control panel with the force of a sledgehammer. The panel exploded in a shower of sparks, and the doors groaned open, revealing the terrifying drop below. There were only 2 grav chutes left in the rack. One was damaged, its casing cracked and leaking coolant. The other looked intact. "Take the good one," Jack said, shoving the intact chute toward me. "You're the one the world needs. You've got the code, or whatever it was that broke the weave." "No," I said, looking at the 2 chutes. "We're both getting out of here, or neither of us is." "Voss, don't be a hero. That broken one won't hold both of us. It'll flatline halfway down." "Then we'll just have to be very efficient with our gravity," I said, grabbing the damaged chute and the good one. I used my climbing rope, the same one that had held Zelia and me together in the mountains, to lash the 2 chutes into a single makeshift rig. It was a foobar solution, a piece of mountain man engineering that would have made an Aethel scientist weep with frustration. "If this doesn't work," Jack said, his voice trembling as we stepped into the open air, "I just want to say, I'm sorry about everything." "Save it for the ground, Jax," I said, gripping the activation cord. "Ready?" He nodded, his hand finding mine in a grip that was entirely human. 3, 2, 1. We jumped. The fall was a blur of gray sky and white heat. For 30 seconds, we were just 2 more pieces of debris falling from the zenith. Then I pulled the cord. The grav chutes ignited with a bone-jarring jerk. The damaged one screamed, a high-pitched whine that suggested it was about to disintegrate, but the good one held. We swung wildly under the flickering blue light of the gravity fields, the platform of Zenith City passing us like a falling world. It hit the lake 5 kilometers away. The explosion was silent at first, a massive wall of white water and steam that rose 500 meters into the air. Then the sound hit us, a thunderous, world-ending boom that shook the very air in our lungs. The shockwave tossed us around like leaves in a storm, but the grav chutes held. We drifted down toward the ruins of the Chicago shoreline, the sky raining pieces of white alloy. The city was gone. The harmony was broken. We hit the ground hard, tumbling through a thicket of mutated ivy and rusted rebar. I felt my ribs give way, a sharp, blinding pain that finally put the lights out. The last thing I felt was the wet, cold earth against my face. It was dirty, it was messy, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I woke up to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of someone crying. It wasn't a pretty sound. It was jagged, ugly, and full of raw, unfiltered grief. It was the sound of a human being remembering how to feel. I opened my eyes, my vision swimming in a sea of gray and orange. I was lying in a makeshift medical tent, the walls made of scavenged tarps and Aethel alloy sheets. My body was wrapped in bandages, the cooling gel of the Aethel medical supplies doing its best to soothe the burns that covered 60% of my skin. "Easy there, Voss," a voice said. I turned my head. Miller was sitting on a crate next to me, her face smeared with soot and her arm in a sling. She looked like she'd been through a war, which I suppose she had. Where is she?" I wheezed, my throat feeling like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. "She's outside," Miller said, her expression softening, dealing with the fallout. "It's a mess out there, Kaylin. A beautiful, terrifying mess." I struggled to sit up, my muscles screaming in protest. Miller helped me, her grip firm and steady. She led me to the opening of the tent, and I looked out at the world we had created. The ruins of the Chicago shoreline were covered in a layer of white ash, the remains of Zenith City. Hundreds of people were wandering through the debris. Some were sitting in the dirt, staring at their hands in disbelief. Others were wandering aimlessly, calling out names of people they hadn't thought of in 10 years. There were Aethel there too. They weren't floating anymore. They were walking on the ground, their crystalline skin dulled by the ash. They looked as lost as the humans. For the first time, there was no hierarchy. There was just 1,000 terrified souls trying to figure out what happened to the world. And in the middle of it all was Zelia. She was standing on a rusted car chassis, her sea-green skin glowing with a soft, pulsing light. She was surrounded by a group of humans, her hands moving in a rhythmic pattern as she spoke to them. She wasn't using the synthesized harmonics of her people. She was speaking their language, her voice full of the cracks and tremors of someone who was feeling everything at once. "Kaylin!" she cried, seeing me. She sprinted across the dirt, her liquid mercury hair flying behind her. She didn't stop until she slammed into me, her arms wrapping around my neck in a grip that made my scorched ribs groan. "You're alive," she whispered, her silver tears hot against my skin. "I thought, Cyrano, when the platform fell." "I'm too stubborn to die, Zilia," I muttered, burying my face in her shoulder. "You should know that by now." We stood there for a long time, held together by the gravity of our own choices. Around us, the world was waking up, but it wasn't the harmony the Aethel had promised. It was the fragile, cold dawn of a new era. But the peace didn't last. A sudden, high-pitched whine cut through the sounds of the camp. It wasn't the sound of a falling city. It was the sound of a weapon charging. I looked toward the remains of the Zenith's command spire, which had survived the crash and was now wedged into the lakebed like a jagged tombstone. A beam of pulsing, violet light was beginning to emanate from the top of the spire, reaching up toward the gray clouds. "The Archon," Zilia gasped, her skin turning a frantic, bruised indigo. "He's survived. He's initiating the last harvest." "What is it?" Miller asked, her hand moving to the hilt of her rifle. "A desperation move," Zilia said, her eyes fixed on the spire. "It's a global frequency pulse. It won't relink the weave. The paradox code made that impossible, but it will erase the neural pathways of everyone currently offline. It's a total mind wipe. If he can't have them as fuel, he'll leave them as empty shells." "How long?" I asked, already looking for my gear. 10 minutes, maybe 15. The capacitors are charging from the lake's geothermal energy." I looked at the spire. It was a kilometer away, surrounded by a churn of boiling water and twisted metal. My body was a wreck. I could barely stand, let alone launch an assault on a fortified position. "We don't have enough people for a frontal attack," Miller said, looking at her exhausted fighters. "We're hosed." "No," I said, a slow, grim realization settling in my gut. "We don't need an army. We just need to get one person inside to pull the plug." I looked at Jax, who was sitting near the fire, his black armor scarred and broken. He met my gaze, and I saw the same fear I felt reflecting in his eyes. "Jax," I said, "you still remember the security codes for the spire's interior?" He stood up, his movements stiff, most of them. "But they'll have changed the encryption once the weave broke. I'd need a high-level Aethel signature to get past the primary gates." He looked at Zilia. "I am the High Archon's daughter," she said, her voice turning to steel. "My signature is the override." "No," I said, stepping between them. "You're not going in there. He'll kill you the second he sees you." "Kaylin, there is no other way," Zilia said, touching my cheek. "I am the only one who can talk to the machine. You are the only one who can get me to the door. And Jax is the only one who knows the layout." I looked at the two of them, the traitorous guard and the rebel princess, and then I looked at my own hands, shaking with pain and exhaustion. "This is the most foobar plan in the history of rescues," I said. "Which is why it's going to work," Jax said, managed a weak, jagged smile. We moved toward the spire as the violet light grew brighter, casting long, sickly shadows across the ruins. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the sound of the world's final countdown. We reached the base of the spire, a twisted mass of white alloy rising out of the water. Two peacekeepers, the last of the Archon's loyalists, stood guard at the entrance. They weren't glitching. They were fully powered, their amethyst eyes glowing with a cold, murderous intent. "I'll take the one on the left," Jax said, drawing his combat knife. "I'll take the right," I added, raising my pulse rifle. "Zilia, you stay behind us. Once we clear the door, you run for the console." The battle was short, brutal, and silent. Jax moved with the deadly efficiency of his training, his blade finding the gaps in the peacekeeper's armor. I fired my rifle until the cell was empty, the blue bolts splashing against the guard's shields until they finally buckled. I took a hit to the shoulder, a grazing blow from an echo blade that felt like a hot iron. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. We breached the doors. The interior of the spire was a cathedral of glass and violet light. At the center, suspended in a cage of energy, was the High Archon. He didn't look like a god anymore. He looked like a withered, ancient thing, his skin the color of dried parchment. He was plugged into the spire's systems, his silver blood flowing through the cables like a toxic river. "Zilia," he hissed, his voice echoing through the chamber. You have come to witness the end of your folly. Father, stop this! Xylia cried, her skin pulsing with a desperate glowing green. It's over. The people are free. Free to rot, the Archon roared, his golden eyes burning with a manic intensity. Free to suffer the chaos of their own insignificance. I gave them a gift. I gave them eternity. You gave them a tomb, I shouted, stepping into the light. The Archon's gaze shifted to me. The ghost, the little rescue man who thinks he can save a world with a piece of rope and a stubborn heart. You have destroyed everything, human, but you will not survive to see the ruins. The violet light reached a crescendo. The spire groaned, the energy building to a point of no return. Xylia, the console! I yelled. She dived for the interface, but the Archon raised his hand, and a wall of concussive force threw her back. She hit the floor hard, the paradox crystal skittering away across the glass. Jax charged, but a pulse of energy slammed him into a pillar, his armor shattering under the pressure. I was the only one left. I looked at the Archon, and then I looked at the console. Between me and the shutdown switch was a 10-meter gap of raw, surging energy. To cross it would be a death sentence. Courage isn't the absence of fear, I whispered. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just walked. The energy hit me like a physical wall, peeling the bandages from my burns and searing my skin. My vision turned white, the pain so intense that it ceased to be a sensation and became a world. I felt my heart stutter, my lungs fail, my mind begin to fracture under the weight of the Archon's spite, but I kept moving. 1 step, 2 steps. I saw my father in the mountains. I saw Sarah Keller's smile. I saw Xylia's silver tears. 5 steps. My hand touched the console. It was hot, the metal melting under my touch. You should be dead, the Archon screamed, his voice full of a sudden, piercing terror. No human can withstand this. Maybe not, I wheezed, my voice sounding like it was coming from 1,000 miles away. But I'm a rescue specialist, and I'm not done yet. I slammed my charred hand onto the emergency purge. The violet light didn't explode, it imploded. The spire gave a final mournful hum and went dark. The Archon let out a long, rattling breath and collapsed, his body dissolving into a cloud of silver dust as the link to the machines was severed. The silence that followed was absolute. I fell to my knees, the darkness closing in. I felt someone's arms catch me, someone's cool skin against my face. Kaelin? Kaelin, stay with me. I looked up at Xylia. Her skin was a vibrant, beautiful emerald, glowing with a life that was finally, gloriously hers. We did it, I whispered. She didn't answer with words. She just held me, her silver tears falling onto my face like a blessing. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting a fragile golden light over the ruins of Chicago. The world was a mess. 1 billion people were waking up to a reality they hadn't seen in 10 years. There would be hunger, there would be disease, and there would be war. But as I looked at the sunrise, I realized it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Because for the first time in history, it belonged to us. We were broken, we were scarred, and we were terrified. We were home. The first thing I truly heard after the violet light swallowed the world was the sound of 1 billion heartbeats finally falling out of sync. In the Aethel harmony, the world had been a metronome, steady, predictable, and soul-crushingly quiet. But as the spire collapsed into the churning waters of Lake Michigan and the neural weave dissolved into static, that silence shattered. It was replaced by a cacophony that no mountain rescue manual could have prepared me for. It was the sound of people realizing they were cold, that their feet hurt, and that the person standing next to them was a stranger they hadn't actually spoken to in a decade. I was lying on a piece of corrugated tin, my body a roadmap of 3rd-degree burns and nerve damage. Every time the wind shifted, the ash from the fallen city dusted over me like gray snow. Voss, stay with us. Stay with. Don't you go dark on me now, you stubborn bastard, a voice rasped. I opened one eye. My vision was a jagged smear of orange and gray. Miller was leaning over me, her face a mask of soot and blood. She looked older than she had an hour ago. Maybe it was just the light, or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in 15 years, She wasn't just a soldier. She was a woman who remembered exactly what she had lost. Zelia? I wheezed. The word felt like a hot coal in my throat. She's alive, Kalen, Miller said, her hand squeezing my shoulder. Her grip was shaking. She's out there. Everyone's out there. I managed to turn my head. The ruins of the Chicago shoreline were crawling with ghosts. Thousands of humans were stumbling out of the wreckage of the suburban hubs, their white robes stained with the muck of the real world. They were wandering through the debris of the zenith, touching the twisted alloy with trembling fingers. Some were screaming, low animal sounds of pure terror. Others were simply sitting in the dirt, weeping with a rhythmic, heavy grief that seemed to shake the very ground. And then there were the Aethel. Without the central mind, the overseers were no longer gods. They were just tall, spindly creatures with skin like sea glass, looking at the humans with a confusion that mirrored our own. I saw a group of former peacekeepers standing in a circle, their weapons dropped in the ash. They weren't fighting. They weren't commanding. They were just shivering, their bioluminescence flickering in erratic, panicked patterns. It's a total snafu, Voss, Miller muttered, looking out at the chaos. We broke the cage, but I don't think anyone remembers how to fly. Help me up, I said. Voss, you're literally missing half your skin. Sit the hell down. I'm a rescue specialist, Miller, I grunted, forcing my scorched muscles to move. And right now, the whole damn planet is a level 10 extraction. Help me up. It took 3 of them to get me onto my feet. Jax was one of them. His black armor was cracked, revealing the human skin beneath, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot. He didn't look like a traitor anymore. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a nightmare and realized the bedroom was on fire. Steady, Voss, Jax whispered, his hand firm under my arm. I've got you. We moved through the camp, which was nothing more than a collection of huddles in the dirt. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and the ozone of dying technology. Everywhere I looked, I saw the cost of our victory. A woman was clutching a dead Aethel guard, her tears washing the silver blood from its chest. She didn't know why she was crying for the enemy, only that for the first time in a decade, she felt the weight of a life ending. I found Zelia near a pile of shattered crystalline glass that had once been a meditation chamber. She was surrounded by a dozen humans, her skin a soft, mournful indigo. She was holding a small child, a girl no older than 6, who was shivering violently. Zelia wasn't using her alien technology to soothe the girl. She was just rocking her, singing a low melodic song that had no words but carried the weight of 1,000 years of longing. She looked up as I approached. Her golden eyes were clouded with silver fluid, but when she saw me, they brightened into a vibrant, glowing emerald. Kalen, she whispered, standing up carefully so as not to wake the child. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just leaned my head against hers, our skin meeting in the middle of the ash and the ruins. Her pulse was erratic, a beautiful, messy rhythm that felt more real than any machine. The High Archon. He is truly gone, she asked. He's dust, I said. She looked out at the shivering crowds, at the Aethel and humans standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud. He was right about one thing, she said softly. The order is gone. The struggle has returned. Good, I said, looking at a man nearby who was struggling to light a fire with 2 pieces of rusted steel. He was cursing, his face red with frustration, but he was doing it. He was trying. It's about time we started working for our keep again. The next 48 hours were a blur of triage and trauma. The resistance fighters, the ones who had lived in the dirt for years, became the new teachers. They taught the optimized citizens how to build fires, how to filter water, and how to bandage a wound without a dermal regenerator. It was a slow, painful process. For every person who embraced the return of their senses, there was another who curled into a ball and begged for the harmony to come back. I spent most of my time in the medical tent, not as a patient, but as a counselor. My burns were healing slowly, the Aethel gels doing the heavy lifting, but my mind was stuck on a loop. I kept seeing the Archon's face as he dissolved, that moment of pure terror when he realized that a single human heart could outlast his perfect machine. Jax came to see me on the 3rd night. He was carrying 2 tins of scavenged peaches. Miller says we're heading north tomorrow, he said, sitting on a crate, toward the old mining colonies. They've got geothermal heat and enough soil to start a crop. You going with them? I asked. He looked at his hands, the hands that had killed ghosts in the name of peace. I don't know if they'll have me, Voss. Some of these people, they remember my face from the raids. I looked at him, at the raw guilt written in the lines around his eyes. You saved my life on the descent, Jax, and you helped pull Zillia through that door. That's a start. In this world, a start is all anyone gets. He nodded, a small, jagged smile touching his lips. Thanks, Kalen. As he left, I looked at the peaches in the tin. They were bruised, sweet, and slightly metallic from the can. They were imperfect. They were exactly what I needed. Zillia joined me a few minutes later, her skin casting a soft, comforting light in the dark tent. The council has formed, she said. 3 humans, 3 Aethel. They are calling it the Convergence. Sounds formal, I said. It is a beginning, she replied, sitting beside me. But there is a problem. The Aethel, many of my people are dying. Without the central mind to regulate our biorhythms, our cells are breaking down. We were not designed to exist as individuals for long. I looked at her, a cold fear gripping my chest. And you? She touched my hand, her skin warm and vibrant. I am different. My descent, it changed my frequency. Nara, my mother, she believes that the emotions I have felt, the fear and the love, have acted as a new kind of regulator. I am surviving because I am learning to be messy. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her indigo skin fading into a soft, contented green. But the others, they need to learn how to feel, Kalen. They need to learn how to be human, or they will fade away like shadows. Then we'll teach them, I said, looking out at the campfire burning in the ruins of Chicago. We'll teach them that the scars are what keep the heat in. The journey north began at dawn on the 5th day. We were a column of 5,000 souls, a mix of human and alien, soldiers and scientists, ghosts and puppets. We moved through the ruins of the old world, carrying the seeds of a new one in our rucksacks and our hearts. It was the hardest rescue I had ever been a part of. There were no ropes, no helicopters, and no easy exits. There was just the long, slow climb toward a future that wasn't guaranteed. But as I walked through the ash, my hand in Zelia's, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away from the fire. I was walking toward the sun. 3 years have passed since the day Zenith City fell from the clouds. We don't call this place Ethelgard anymore. We don't even call it Earth. Most of us just call it the slope. It's a fitting name for a world where every single day feels like an uphill climb against gravity, hunger, and the lingering ghosts of a perfect past. The Iron Root Mountains are no longer my hiding place. They are the heart of the new world. We've built the settlement of New Hope into the side of the Obsidian Ridge, using a mix of salvaged Aethel alloy and good old-fashioned timber. It's a jagged, ugly-looking place, full of mismatched roofs and smoke-belching chimneys. But at night, when the lights flicker on, it looks more alive than Zenith City ever did. I stood on the balcony of the central infirmary, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, a color that always reminded me of Zillia's skin when she was thinking too hard. My left arm still doesn't work right. The nerves are a jumble of static, and my face is a patchwork of skin grafts that don't quite match. I move with a limp, and my lungs whistle when the air gets too cold. I am a walking record of every mistake I've ever made. Voss, we've got a situation at the South Pass. I turned to see Jax jogging up the stairs. He'd traded his black armor for a reinforced leather duster and a pair of heavy work boots. He was the head of the New Hope Search and Rescue Team now, a group of 20 humans and 5 Aethel who spent their days pulling travelers out of rock slides and snowdrifts. What is it, Jax? I asked, grabbing my medical kit with my one good hand. A transport skiff from the coastal colonies. They hit a thermal pocket and went down in the gorge. 6 survivors. 3 of them are unlinked civilians who just finished their transition. They're panicking, Kalen. They've never felt cold like this before. I'll get the gear, I said. I didn't call for a drone. I didn't check an algorithm. I grabbed a coil of hemp rope and a mechanical lantern. Zillia was waiting at the gate. She was wearing a heavy wool cloak over her emerald skin, her golden eyes sharp and alert. She was the lead mediator for the convergence, the one who translated the messy emotions of the humans into something the Aethel could understand, and vice versa. "Be careful, Kalen," she said, her hand lingering on my scarred cheek. "The wind is picking up." "I'm always careful, Zelia. You know that." She laughed, a sound that was no longer a synthesized harmonic, but a rich, throaty chuckle that she'd learned from Miller. "You are many things, Kalen Varro, but careful has never been one of them." She leaned in and kissed me, her skin glowing with a warmth that felt like home. "Come back for dinner. I'm attempting to make that stew Miller told me about. If it's the one with the mountain leaks, I might stay in the gorge," I joked. The rescue took 7 hours. We found the survivors huddled in the wreckage of the skiff, half buried in a snowbank at the bottom of the Black Gorge. They were shivering, their faces blue with cold, their eyes wide with the raw, terrifying realization of their own fragility. One of the men, a former Aethel architect named Talon, was clutching his leg and screaming. It was a clean break, but to him it was the end of the universe. He'd never felt pain before. He'd never felt the world trying to break him. "It hurts," he wailed as I knelt beside him. "Make it stop. Relink me. Please." I grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at me. "It's supposed to hurt, Thalen," I shouted over the wind. "That's how you know you're still here." I pulled a flask of medicinal whiskey from my kit, a rough, burning liquid we distilled from mountain berries. "Drink this. It'll taste like fire, and then it'll make your head spin." He took a swallow, gagging as the alcohol hit his throat. Why is it so hard?" he wheezed, his skin flickering a dull, pained gray. "Because it's real," I said, beginning to set his leg with 2 wooden splints. "Because you're making a choice to stay alive, instead of just being kept alive." I worked with a steady, rhythmic focus, my one good hand moving with a precision that comes from years of refusing to give up. I didn't use a dermal regenerator. I used cloth bandages and iron-willed patience. By the time we hauled the last survivor up the cliff face, the sun was beginning to rise. We stood on the edge of the gorge, a group of exhausted, shivering, and triumphant beings. Jax was sharing his rations with a human woman who had lost her shoes in the crash. Miller was swearing at a broken winch. I looked at my hands, charred, scarred, and trembling with fatigue. I looked at the survivors who were weeping with relief and clutching each other for warmth. This was the reward. Not a medal, not a perfect world, and not a life without pain. The reward was the right to keep climbing. I spent a long time that morning sitting on a rock, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys of New Hope. I used to think that being a rescue specialist meant getting people back to the way they were before the accident. I thought a successful mission was one where everyone came home without a scratch, where the wounds were closed and the memories were wiped clean. I spent my whole life hiding in the mountains, thinking that my scars were a sign that I had failed, that I wasn't strong enough or fast enough to keep the world from biting me. But looking at the ruins of Zenith City and the messy, beautiful struggle of New Hope, I realized I was wrong. The rescue isn't about getting back to perfection. It's about finding the courage to exist in the wreckage. Humanity isn't something you protect in a glass case. It's something you earn every time you choose to feel the cold, the grief, and the fear, and then decide to take another step anyway. We spent 15 years being told that pain was an error. We were offered a world without loss, a life without shadows, and for a while we believed it. But a life without shadows is a life without depth. It's a flat, empty map that leads nowhere. I'm glad I'm broken. I'm glad I've got these burns and this limp, because every scar I have is a story of a time I chose to be real over being perfect. We saved the world, not by fixing it, but by allowing it to be broken again. And honestly, I wouldn't trade one of these cold, shivering mornings for 1,000 years of Aethel peace. I watched a small mountain flower, a hardy blue thing we call a rock breaker, pushing its way through a crack in a discarded piece of zenith alloy. It was small, it was fragile, and it was absolutely relentless. I wonder, as you look at your own life, at the parts of yourself you've tried to hide, or the mistakes you wish you could erase, what if those aren't your failures? What if the things you think make you less are actually the only things that make you real? If someone offered you a world without pain, but it cost you the ability to truly choose your own path, would you take it, or would you choose to stay here in the dirt, with the scars and the stories, and keep climbing with me? I reached down and touched the petal of the blue flower, my scarred thumb surprisingly gentle. Then I stood up, ignored the ache in my hip, and started the walk back home. The stew was probably burning, and I didn't want to miss a single bite.